Thanks for stopping by Big Top Gaming. My name's Brian, and in this video we're continuing the tactics deck review and faction identity discussion for A Song of Ice and Fire, the miniatures game, the 2021 version. And this one is going to be a doozy. This is House Targaryen. So in the same theme of the other videos, I'll kind of put down my initial thoughts for what I think the faction's really pointing itself at, and then we'll kind of go into some of the reasoning why through the tactics cards. So the House Targaryen faction really seems to hinge on putting on a lot of pressure through battlefield control and movement shenanigans. So I think that's really kind of like the core identity from the deck at least, but when we talk about faction identity overall, all the factions we've had so far and the factions that we'll be discussing after this, a lot of that identity can be sussed out from the tactics deck itself. But for the Targaryens, that's not so easy to do because they're kind of like the potpourri of military, right? So Daenerys doesn't really have the greatest military backing or experience on her own. The reason why the tactics deck, at least in my opinion, is really centered around a lot of movement shenanigans, it almost feels like it is the Dothraki tactics deck. And I think a lot of that flavor has to do with Daenerys's military experience or knowledge about fighting. It came while she was kind of hanging out with the Dothraki a lot. You know, she kind of grew up with that battle strategy in mind. But then, since the army itself is composed of a lot of different units from different walks of life, and they are very much, most of them are not ones that Westerosi tacticians have really seen. Those units end up plugging into the list a little differently, and when you kind of have things that don't really align to a central focus, having a tactics deck that centers around movement as being one of the main themes really works out well. It gets those units to work together because, you know, they all like to move. So I think that's kind of ties in a little bit into the faction identity, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the ways that the faction identity gets warped a little bit or shaped as we get along through the tactics discussion. But the faction itself is comprised of like the Dothraki, who play very differently from the Unsullied, and they play very differently from dragons, and then they play differently from the Stormcrows as well. So Daenerys kind of brings a lot of new technology to the wars of the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, and that seems to be communicated very well in the Cool Mini or Nots version of the game. So to kick off the base Targaryen tactics deck, the first card we come up with is Overrun. This triggers when a friendly unit surges forth. Instead of surging forth, this unit performs one charge action, and if you control the maneuver position, that unit can reroll any charge distance dice. So Overrun's a card or mechanic that we've been exposed to throughout the entirety of A Song of Ice and Fire. I believe it was on the Mountain as a commander first. It might have even just been his order. I can't remember quite exactly where it originated, but we're all used to this whole, instead of surging forth, you get to do a charge thing. Now, not pivoting beforehand is kind of rough, so you'll need to make sure that you have your positioning down well. So if you happen to be going into a unit with Overrun in your hand and you feel like you're going to be able to wipe them out, you want to set yourself up to make sure that you can get into a unit and take full advantage of this card. Having the maneuver position can help out to make sure that you're going to get those charges if they happen to be a little risky, and you also don't want to just play a tactics card to lose out on a charge by failing it or getting it disordered. So Overrun itself is a really nice way for the Targaryens to kind of steamroll or kind of mound up an advantage they already have. Like, as an opponent, losing a unit is bad enough, but then instead of in having that unit do another charge action is a pretty big blow, even if you end up not wiping out the other unit. So Overrun is kind of a good palate cleanser to say this is kind of what the Targaryens are bringing to the table in their tactics deck. Next up is Sudden Retreat. This triggers after an enemy unit completes a melee attack. The defender can perform one retreat action. So this is nice in a lot of ways. Much in the way I talked about the control tactics of the Lannisters being kind of hard to discuss because you really never know how disrupting the control is going to be until you actually put those models to the table and see how those cards play out. So with movement shenanigans, it's a little bit like that, where you don't really get to know how important a retreat action out of turn could be until you actually do it. And since Sudden Retreat can do a lot of really neat things for you, what I like to do with cards like Sudden Retreat is I like to hold them for the unit's actual activation instead of them getting like an extra attack out of an order or the tactic zone or something. Because then, if they've already activated, depending on where you're at, you could retreat out of the way and get into their flank, or if you were already in their flank, you could retreat and get into the sides or rear of other things. Considering a lot of the times you're playing this card, it's going to be on something like cavalry or something that can really get around the table. Not to say they're the only good targets for this card, but it's definitely there's more advantages to playing this on cavalry than there is on an infantry unit. But the Targaryen stuff in general isn't extremely survivable. I mean, the Unsullied are a different story, but most of this is kind of lower or higher defense saves, so not as great defense saves, and being able to just kind of get hit once and retreat out of the way, especially if they happen to have some tokens on them that are making that attack not super great, is going to be really good for trying to flex your battlefield position. And when somebody sees something like this happen that they weren't expecting, like a retreat to put a unit in the back of their table to go after some of their objective holders, or maybe go after a unit that really doesn't like being attacked in the rear arc, it can really confuse almost their entire game plan. They have to kind of really shift what they're doing and rebalance their entire tactics for the rest of the game, because this one unit might have retreated out and disrupted the position or the flow or the tempo of the game. Next up is Swift Reposition. Now, this is an alteration from Swift Advance. I don't think anything has any card that's quite similar to Swift Advance anymore. That card was definitely a little too over the top, and in Targaryens, where you could just kind of rocket launch something up to 18 inches or more across the table, it was just a little too powerful or too abusive. So Swift Reposition is the alteration of that, and even though it's cut down the movement by quite a bit, it's still an amazing card. This happens to trigger at the start of any turn, and you can target one friendly combat unit. It ends up shifting 2 inches. If you control the maneuver, that unit performs a 3-inch maneuver instead. So before I talk about Swift Reposition in terms of its value, there's something that probably needs to be clarified in the rules or in an FAQ. And now, I haven't reviewed any FAQs to see if this has been addressed already, because I don't think we've ever had anything come up like this in the past. But I did read enough through the rules a couple times to just kind of absorb it, but there doesn't seem to be anything in the rulebook at current that stops you from shifting in combat. Now, that's not a huge deal in general, because the only way you can shift in this game is by doing a ranged attack, and ranged attacks can't be performed while you're engaged, so the shift, you can never get to that shift to figure out what to do with it. Now, maneuvers, marches, and charges can't be done when you're engaged. That's very specific in the rules, but the shift isn't really addressed in terms of how it would work with this card. So if you were really threading the needle on interpretation, this card allows you to shift out of combat. I really don't think that is the intention that Cool Mini or Not has for this, and if you have a better grasp on the rules than I do, or have a better grip on FAQs that have happened, post in the comments below to kind of correct me on this one. But for right now, to me, it looks like you can shift out of combat with this card. But the gist is that the extra 2 inches, outside of being skeezy and shifting out of engagements, it helps you get a little bit of extended threat, especially on some of those models or units that don't have the cavalry maneuver that they can start off with, because those cavalry maneuvers at 6 inches for most of the faction really do a lot to get you into combat early or quickly, or get to where you want to be. Some of those other slower units, like the Unsullied or the Stormcrows of the not dervish variety, those ones are going to really appreciate this card, and the maneuver can be quite nice to help you get that little bit of extra that you need to get into a flank for a charge that your opponent didn't think you were going to get, because with the maneuver, when you have the the horse on the tactics board, that means you actually get to pivot before and after when you're done with that, so you can make sure that you're lining up to get those flank charges a little bit with some of the slower units, and sometimes even with cavalry that might be enough to actually get you into the rear of a model or of a tray, and it seems really good at that. So this is just like, instead of Swift Advance being the the super I'm going to get the alpha on you right away, Swift Reposition has kind of turned the card into more of a nuanced tinkering with how your positioning is going on the table, and I think it's a fine change, even if a lot of people will view this as a really negative change. Next up, we have Fire and Blood. This triggers when a friendly unit is performing a charge action before rolling the charge distance dice. You choose one of the modes below, and if you control the maneuver position on the tactics board, you choose two of them instead. The first mode is that this unit may re-roll any charge distance dice this turn. The second is that if this unit successfully charges, its melee attacks gain Sundering this turn. And the final one is, if this unit successfully charges, its melee attacks gain Vicious this turn. So it's a really versatile card for making sure that your units can get some extra combat oomph out of them. Sometimes, depending on which attachments you might be taking, you could really get technically all three of these. I think there's one of the Dothraki Screamer attachments or Outriders. I can't remember which one it is, but I thought one of them gave Sundering when they charged, but I haven't fully absorbed all of the attachments for the Targaryens just yet. So at any rate, you're typically going to be wanting to have the maneuver position as a Targaryen player. It's just more ways to kind of control and manipulate the movement on the battlefield. And the maneuver position, this might be a little bit late in the video to say it, is the only tactics board position that the Targaryens actually interact with. They don't use two of them like most of the factions do. It's another unique part of their internal identity. But with this one, you can make sure that you're re-rolling charges on a unit that needs to get them, especially when we're talking about those non-cavalry units again. So this, even if you just want to use this as a one-shot instead of having that maneuver position, you can still take advantage out of a lot of things, because either the unit you're going to be going into has high armor, so the Sundering's going to help out, or it'll have the or it'll have a low morale stat, or low morale stat, I guess. So the Vicious will help you get some extra damage across. It's just Fire and Blood is extremely versatile and will help you push forward that combat prowess with the army when some of their stuff might seem a little bit lacking when you look at the just base rules of those units. Now we come up across one of the new cards, completely new to the Targaryens. Not an alteration of anything, it's just brand new. This one's called Field Control, and this triggers when when any NCU, claims the maneuver position on the tactics board. If that NCU was friendly, you can replace the zone's effect with one friendly combat unit gets to perform a maneuver or retreat action with +1 speed, and any enemies it disengages with become weakened. The second mode for this is, if the NCU was an enemy, you may force your opponent to replace that zone's effect with one friendly combat unit becomes weakened, and then they shift 3 inches. So this card's really neat. It's something that the Targaryens don't really seem to be well known for, is tactics board manipulation outside of just adding a completely new zone to the table. But being able to kind of get a boost on what the maneuver position does for you when you grab it, making sure that you get that +1 speed for the entire, for just that action, and then if you happen to be engaged with something, making sure they become weakened when you retreat off of them. Make sure that if your opponent tries to get into you in any way, shape, or form, they are at least weakened when they do it. Otherwise, just getting that extra threat range on the maneuver is really nice as well. The big thing that I like about this is, since the maneuver position is the only tactic zone that the Targaryens like to have, your opponent is probably going to want to be taking that away from you whenever they get the opportunity to. And having field control in your hand when that happens makes sure that they don't take a whole lot of advantage out of it. They only get to shift 3 inches instead of maneuvering, so they don't get to do that pivot that they might be interested in, and they also become weakened when they do it. So whatever unit they pick to do this with is the one that gets weakened. So it might be that the unit they're wanting to extend that threat with this zone claimed is not a unit they want weakened at all, because they want to make sure that they can get that extra damage in, and 3 inches is probably enough to get them within threat range of your stuff, but not within threat range of a charge for them. So I think that this is another one of those cards that really communicates this battlefield control perspective that the Targaryens have kind of really centered or focused in on. And this one's another card that's just going to make your opponent kind of, you'll see maybe some smoke coming out of their ears when you play it, because it is so disruptive, and it might not look like it on the front end. Next up, we have Unstoppable Advance, and this is a it's two mode card. Not so much like how Fire and Blood was, but this has two very unique different things that it can do depending on the situation of the game. The first mode of this card triggers when a friendly unit activates. This turn, that unit may ignore dangerous, hindering, and rough keywords, and then you destroy any terrain with the destructible keyword that they move through or end within 1 inch of. The second mode of this card, so when you play it, when triggers open up for this card, you basically can choose which trigger you want to utilize before you play the card, of course. The second trigger is very different from the first. It's when a friendly unit surges forth, the unit gains +3 speed when maneuvering during its surge forth action. So the first mode of this card is pretty good. I think that terrain is extremely important in the game, and I think a lot of times when people are putting down their own selections of terrain, it's really easy to get stuck in the trap of putting down weirwoods because they don't hinder your movement whatsoever and they just make your morale better. Hopefully that kind of goes away because the panic tests, unless you're playing against Lannisters, have kind of gotten a little less impactful. I mean, the free folk can do some nasty stuff with panic too, but being able to kind of control movement, especially against Targaryens, your opponent might be more likely to not put things like bad terrain on the table so they don't have to deal with it because they know you can get around it. But then you can start dropping some of these things that are difficult for them to deal with. And then by playing the top version of Unstoppable Advance, it means that you don't have to waste a melee attack to get rid of some annoying destructible terrain. And it also means that if you do happen to put a piece of terrain that's difficult to get around or get through in the middle of the table, it means that you've got this chance with Unstoppable Advance to just kind of really shut it down and not have to worry about it. So your opponent is going to always have to respect your threats, even if they're trying to hide behind some kind of terrain that's going to make it more difficult for you to get in because you've got this card to stop that. Now, the second part of Unstoppable Advance, being able to get that +3 maneuver when you surge forth, is really powerful as well. I mean, I've already talked about it a little bit with the retreat, but being able to get an extra 3 inches means that you can position yourself in a little bit better of a space, so when you do surge forth, it's very difficult for your opponent to respond to that because that might give you enough movement to go completely behind them to where they don't even have line of sight to charge you. And I think that is extremely powerful, but you won't actually get to see the value of it until you actually start playing with it. Again, it's still that Lannister thing where every single one of these cards seems to make more sense when you see the situation of the table, and they always kind of alter their use depending on what's going on. The final card in the Targaryen Tactics deck is Blood of the Dragon. This triggers at the start of any turn. You target one friendly combat unit and attach this card to them until the end of the game. When a friendly unit is destroyed, you place one order token on this card. While this card has a token, the attached unit's melee attacks gain +1 attack die, and this unit suffers -1 wound from failing panic tests. So this is another one of those like oath type cards that previously you would have had to kind of sit with this in your hand until the actual trigger or the specific trigger ended up happening. But with this one, you just, as soon as it pops up in your hand, you can throw it on the unit you want. And Targaryen units are pretty squishy in general, so you're likely to be able to lose one. Sometimes you might even want to like dangle one out, like one of your freedmen in front of your opponent, to say that this is a unit that I want you to take out, and that'll trigger Blood of the Dragon and give this unit some extra buffs in combat and make sure that they stick around a little bit longer. So it's a really good card to kind of make your opponent think twice about taking out pieces that you have, because regardless of where they are on the table, Blood of the Dragon is going to get that order token, and then that unit's going to get a little bit more dangerous. Think about taking something like your Unsullied Swordsman and just throwing a freedman out in front of them. Your opponent needs to get through them to get to those Unsullied Swordsmen, and once they do, they're rolling they're rolling another die, and it's very difficult to get them off from panic tests. So Blood of the Dragon is just a really fantastic card. There's very few of these cards that are like they attach, and then as something happens, they end up getting their bonuses. There's very few of them out there that I don't like. I think that this type of like umbrella change in the game is really welcome in making sure that you don't have cards getting clunky in your hand, so that you pitch them when you really don't, when you need more cards, but then you regret it when you don't have that card in your hand and that specific trigger occurs. So I'm a big fan of cards like Blood of the Dragon, and for the Targaryens, it's just another way to get some extra combat prowess when they don't have a whole lot of cards in their deck that really do that in the base tactics deck. I do have to take a slight moment to kind of talk about something that I was thinking of while I was actually just talking about this card right now. The freedmen have that ability that says if they aren't around any untrained, or if they aren't around a unit without untrained masses, they end up getting removed from the table. So for Blood of the Dragon, this order token can get placed on a unit when a friendly unit is destroyed. That stipulation in the freedmen's rule says that you destroy that unit if they aren't around someone with untrained masses. So in my mind's eye, I really thought my interpretation of Blood of the Dragon was that it needed to be destroyed by an enemy attack. That's really not the case here, and the freedmen can just trigger this card for free at the beginning of the round. So it's not, you can't do something like trigger untrained masses and then put this card on, because the untrained masses stipulation on the freedmen happens at the start of the round and not the start of a turn where this card triggers. So you would have to make sure that you trigger it towards the end of the round on the previous turn, and then position your freedmen to make sure they get taken out. Now, is it worth 3 points to get this card active? Probably not. I don't think this is something that Cool Mini or Not maybe missed or didn't or the intention isn't communicated very well. I think that losing something like the freedmen just to get this card to work is maybe a calculated risk, or maybe you need this play later on in the game, and that's why you're doing it. So it's just something to be aware of, so you have that in your pocket if you happen to be playing with freedmen, which I think a lot of Targaryen players will, but that's probably a discussion for another video. So that rounds out the discussion centered around the Targaryen-based tactics deck. Now, I can't finish out the discussion without talking about another thing that makes the Targaryens extremely unique, and it really, really flavorful for this. So, as I said at the beginning of the video, Daenerys is not the most practiced military mind in all of, the A Song of Ice and Fire universe. She has a lot of mercenaries at her disposal that just kind of do what they're paid to do, and she doesn't have to really organize them a ton, at least from what I can understand. So what she ends up doing is, during her, she's kind of like that. It's like starting a role-playing game in the old Super Nintendo days, where you kind of just walk from town to town and you just gather people. I'm sure RPGs still do this. I just don't play them that often anymore as I used to. But, it's that classic feel where you start out as this little hero and you're off on your own, going from place to place, and you end up picking up this ragtag group of people that go in and they bring certain skills to your party, and that allows you to kind of cruise through the game and do the things you need to do. Daenerys does that not only with units, but with commanders as well. So a lot of the other military minds who are, more focused on making sure they can handle a whole army or direct a whole army, end up coming into the Targaryen umbrella of commanders. So the thing that makes that really interesting is that all of these commanders have their own unique experiences from their own unique areas, and that's really well represented in the 3 commander cards that they bring. But the thing that's unique about all Targaryen commanders is they bring a 4th commander card, and that one ends up replacing something inside the tactics deck itself, the base tactics deck. And another cool, flavorful thing that I have to applaud Cool Mini or Not for with this one is that the card that gets removed is not trivial. It's always a card that kind of is not something that this particular commander would typically do, or is like, it doesn't make sense that they'd be doing. So if we take a look at something like Barristan the Bold, or Barristan Selmy the Bold, sorry, just to give him his full name because credit where credit's due, right? So a lot of his cards, without getting too deep into what he actually does for Targaryens, are very combat focused. He's standing his ground and pushing on his or pushing out his combat prowess to make sure that the fight goes his way. He's a knight of renown. We've got probably one of the most prolific Kingsguard in the history of all Westeros. But the thing that he ends up doing is he brings a card called Sustained Assault. Now, I don't think the Sustained Assault is maybe it is. I need to dig into it more, but this is not. I'm thinking it's not the. Maybe it is here. So I'm sorry that I kind of had to think that one out while I was going through it. So the card that he brings this Sustained Assault. That's the one that replaces a card in the deck. This is so disjointed. I think this is actually just a cool discovery that I made. So Sustained Assault is a card that rewards you for being engaged and makes sure you fight better and your opponent takes damage a lot easier. The card that he removes from the deck to replace with this one is Sudden Retreat. So someone like Barristan Selmy is not going to be retreating from combat all willy-nilly. He would rather stand his ground and fight until his last breath. So with Sustained Assault, that's a really neat flip they've got in there, and up until now, just looking at it, I'm going to have to go through all these other Targaryen commander cards now to see if they actually are switching out ones that make sense or would make sense for them to not be having. This is not a combat style that Barristan Selmy is very interested in, so it's really cool to see that play out. Overall, though, I think that I've done a good job of kind of supporting my position on how the Targaryens function. It's really, when you pick up this army, you're really picking up 7 or 6 or 8 different armies, because everything kind of works differently when you put it together, and that tactics deck being so versatile with being able to flex on the field in different ways, it really makes it so you can play the game the way you want to. You can use those cards to extend your threat. You can use those cards to kind of manipulate the table, play the scenario, or go for some of those really difficult to get charges in the rear or something like that. Play that huge cavalry list. You want all horses? You can bring a bunch of Dothraki led by Khal Drogo himself. Or if you want to play a really tough phalanx-style army, you can bring a bunch of Unsullied led by Grey Worm, or you can do my favorite buddy cop moment of having a bunch of Unsullied with Daario Naharis on the table, who is now a Targaryen commander, and he will swap a card out for you even though his neutral version doesn't have something like that. So that's another cool thing, a big flavor win for the Targaryens. So I hope you enjoyed this video and continue to enjoy the future ones that I make. I'm really having a good time making these, especially when we get to discover the cool things about the Targaryens. I think they're probably one of the most compelling armies that has kind of hit in the 1.7 update, and I am so jazzed to get them on the table.